Have you prayed countless times and yet felt that God remained silent? What if the real problem isn't a lack of faith, nor the fact that God has stopped speaking, but something much deeper that is preventing you from recognizing His voice? Today you can discover a truth capable of completely transforming your walk with God. Before revealing that answer, you need to understand a reason that most Christians never realize. When this truth becomes clear, your way of seeking, recognizing, and hearing God's voice can change forever. Have you ever had the feeling that God simply stopped answering your prayers? Perhaps you knelt down, opened the Bible, sincerely sought His presence, and yet all you found was a silence that seemed endless. In moments like these, it's easy to think that something is wrong with your faith. Some even believe that God has abandoned them or stopped speaking to them. But what if that's not the truth? What if the silence you're experiencing doesn't mean God's absence, but reveals something much deeper that no one has explained to you? This is a much more common experience than you might imagine. There are people who love God, pray every day, seek to live according to His word, and yet still carry a silent doubt in their hearts. Why can't I hear God's voice? Perhaps this question has crossed your mind too. Maybe you're waiting for guidance on an important decision, an answer to an old prayer, or just a sign that God continues to walk beside you. Have you ever experienced this? The most interesting thing is that the Bible shows that even men and women who had extraordinary faith went through times when God seemed distant. This means that God's silence is not necessarily a sign of rejection, lack of love, or little faith. Often our minds interpret silence as abandonment, while God is doing an invisible work that can only be understood later. It is precisely then that many people give up waiting, let anxiety dominate their thoughts, and begin to believe more in their own emotions than in God's promises. We live in a world full of distractions, worries, and noise. Our minds hardly ever slow down. There are so many thoughts, fears, expectations, and pressures that we end up believing that if God were truly speaking, His voice would be impossible to ignore. But is that how God usually acts? Or is there something within us that is hindering our spiritual perception? What you are about to discover may surprise you, because perhaps the greatest obstacle to hearing God's voice is not in heaven. It is happening within the human heart itself. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this can completely transform the way you seek God's guidance. Perhaps you'll realize that He never stopped speaking. Perhaps you'll discover that the answer you've been searching for has been closer than you imagined all this time. And before we get to that revelation, we need to understand a biblical principle that changed the lives of people who also believed they were experiencing God's silence. And while you reflect on all of this, I wanted to extend a very sincere invitation. If this message resonated with your heart and in some way accurately described the moment you are experiencing, please write in the comments only what you feel compelled to share. Perhaps it's a prayer, a question, a testimony, or even a silent struggle you've never told anyone about. Often, a single message can strengthen another person who is facing the same battle and needs to realize they are not alone. If this content resonates with you, please leave a like. This simple gesture shows YouTube that this message deserves to reach other people who may be going through a period of silence, confusion, or searching for God's voice. It's a practical way to help this word reach places where we alone could never reach. And if you want to continue receiving content like this, which unites the truth of the Bible with the emotions we all face, subscribe to the channel. There are still many teachings that can strengthen your spiritual journey and help you see more clearly what God is doing, even when everything seems silent. Now, there's a detail that almost no one notices when they think about hearing God's voice. It's precisely this detail that makes so many people believe that God doesn't answer their prayers, when in reality, something completely different is happening. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a hidden truth that can completely transform how you see this moment. Often the biggest obstacle to hearing God's voice isn't around you, but within you. Anxiety races the mind, fear distorts decisions, guilt makes you believe you're not worthy of being heard, and an excess of thoughts creates so much noise that any direction seems impossible to recognize. Little by little, the heart begins to confuse this emotional noise with God's silence. But has God really stopped speaking? Or are emotions muffling his voice? Write in the comments, I want to hear the voice of God. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the Bible itself reveals something that completely changes our mindset about how God usually speaks. When the prophet Elijah was tired, afraid, and emotionally exhausted, he expected to find God in grand events. A strong wind came, then an earthquake, and then an impressive fire. But God was not in any of them. It was only when everything quieted down that Elijah heard a still, small voice. This revelation shows that God doesn't always compete with the noise of our minds. Often, he waits for our hearts to slow down so that his direction can be clearly perceived. Perhaps the transformation you seek doesn't begin when God speaks louder, but when the noises that occupy your inner self finally lose their power. Comment below, I want a peaceful heart. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is a truth that can explain why so many sincere people end up making decisions they later regret. When emotions take control, our spiritual perception can become completely distorted. Fear makes it seem like God has abandoned us. Anxiety convinces us that we need to act without waiting. And guilt whispers that we are not worthy to hear his voice. But God has never rejected anyone for being emotionally wounded. On the contrary, the Bible shows a God who welcomes the weary, strengthens the downcast, and restores the broken-hearted. What he doesn't want is for pain to become the voice that guides our choices. There is a difference between feeling an emotion and allowing it to determine the course of our journey. True transformation happens when we learn to present our feelings to God, instead of using them as a compass for every decision. It is in this process that the mindset begins to change, because faith ceases to depend on circumstances and begins to rest in the truth of who God is. And perhaps this is one of the greatest revelations that many Christians still haven't understood. God doesn't ignore your emotions, but he also doesn't want them to take the place of his guidance. Comment below, I choose to trust in God. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a silent error that prevents many Christians from perceiving what God is already doing. Many people expect an extraordinary answer, a sign in the sky, an audible voice, or an event impossible to ignore. But behind the scenes of faith, God often acts very differently. Throughout Scripture, we see that he frequently guides through his word, grants wisdom for important decisions, produces a peace that remains even amidst difficulties, and opens or closes circumstances with a purpose that only becomes clear later. The hidden truth is that while many seek only the spectacular supernatural, they end up missing the constant supernatural presence of God in everyday life. Transformation begins when we understand that hearing God's voice doesn't depend on extraordinary experiences, but on a heart willing to recognize his direction in the small revelations of each day. It is at this moment that the spiritual journey ceases to be an anxious search for signs and becomes a relationship built on trust. Comment below, God speaks to me every day. But there's a detail that almost no one notices. Learning to recognize God's voice doesn't make all problems disappear. What truly changes is the person facing those problems. When spiritual discernment matures, the heart ceases to be governed by fear and begins to find peace, even amidst uncertainty. Decisions stop being born from impulse and begin to be guided by the wisdom that comes from God. This is a silent but powerful transformation, Little by little, you realize that God's voice not only points out a path, it strengthens you to walk it. Circumstances may remain difficult, but the security of knowing that God is guiding every step produces a confidence that no situation can take away. This is how faith grows, not through the absence of struggles, but through the certainty of God's presence at every stage of the journey. Comment below, God is guiding me. Now think about this for a moment. How can you tell if that thought that arose in your heart truly comes from God or is merely a reflection of your emotions? The Bible offers us a sure path to developing this discernment. The first question is, does this align with Scripture? God never contradicts what He Himself has revealed in His Word. The second is, does this thought produce deep peace, even in the face of difficulties, or does it only increase fear, confusion, and anxiety? Although God may confront us, His guidance never leads us to hopeless despair. And there is a third question that makes all the difference. Does this decision bring me closer to God, or does it fuel desires that distance me from Him? These three questions act as a spiritual filter capable of transforming your mindset and preventing you from confusing momentary impulses with the Lord's direction. Many answers that seemed hidden begin to become clear when we stop relying solely on emotions and start evaluating our thoughts in the light of God's truth. Comment below, I want discernment, but there's a step that many people overlook, and perhaps it's the most important one in this entire journey. Creating space to hear God doesn't mean repeating words in prayers, but rather allowing the heart to slow down in His presence. We live surrounded by distractions, worries, and a constant need for immediate answers. But God often works in silence, where the mind finds rest and the soul sees clearly again. Sincere prayer is not just the moment you speak, it's also the moment you choose to listen. Reading the Word renews the mindset, strengthens discernment, and illuminates decisions that previously seemed confusing. And when the heart finds emotional rest in God, what seemed like just emptiness begins to reveal a direction. The truth is that hearing God's voice is not a technique for getting quick answers, but the result of a relationship that matures day by day. The more you walk with Him, the more you learn to recognize His presence, even in moments when no words are spoken. Comment below, I want to be closer to God. After everything we've seen so far, perhaps the greatest revelation isn't that God has spoken again, but that He never stopped speaking. Throughout the Bible, we see a God who continues to guide, correct, comfort, and strengthen those who sincerely seek Him. The real challenge isn't making God speak louder, but learning to recognize His voice amidst the noise of anxiety, fear, expectations, and emotions that so often occupy space within us. When this noise begins to diminish, what once seemed like silence may reveal a direction that has always been present. Perhaps the answer you expected didn't arrive in the way you imagined, but that doesn't mean God remained distant. On the contrary, it's possible He was guiding every step of your journey behind the scenes, preparing your heart before delivering the answer. And this transformation completely changes how we see faith, because we understand that hearing God's voice isn't a rare event, but a relationship that grows every day. Now I want to leave you with a question to reflect on sincerely. And if God is already speaking to you today, is there some noise that is still preventing you from perceiving His voice? If this message touched your heart, leave a comment below. Today, I want to hear God's voice clearly. If this message has brought a new perspective to your heart, don't stop here. Learning to recognize God's voice is just the beginning of a much deeper journey of transformation, discernment, and intimacy with Him. Continue walking with us in the next video, where we will explore another biblical principle that can further strengthen your faith and help you understand more clearly how God guides those who trust in His direction. Perhaps the answer you seek is exactly in the next step of this journey.